Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're tackling quite a stack of sources, actually,
Yeah, we've got archaeological finds, things literally dug out of the ground.
and accounts from sagas, historical writers, plus some modern analysis pulling it all together.
Exactly.
Our mission today is to take a real deep dive into Viking Age arms, armor, and their military tactics.
That's right. We want to move beyond that popular image, maybe almost cartoonish sometimes.
The axe-wielding guy.
Yeah, that one. And use these sources to understand the full complex picture, what they actually fought with, what might have protected them, and, the surprisingly sophisticated ways they approached warfare.
So let's dig into these sources and see what they can tell us about what made the Viking fighter just so formidable for so long.
Let's do it.
Okay, looking at the sources first. The axe. It's definitely the most iconic Viking weapon, right? The one everyone thinks of.
Absolutely. And the sources totally confirm it was incredibly common.
But it wasn't just for battle, was it?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
That's a key point the sources make. It was a fundamental tool for, everyday life. Farming, building things, chopping wood.
Which explains why you find them everywhere.
Exactly. In so many graves, men's, women's graves too.
Yeah.
It was just accessible. The normal weapon, you could say, for the middle-class Viking, if that term fits.
But when they did take it to battle, it wasn't just your basic wood-chopping axe. The sources show they evolved.
Oh, definitely. They developed larger heads, longer shafts for better reach and power. You see specific types mentioned, like the bearded axe.
That's the one with the hook-like bit?
Yeah, that extended lower edge. Super useful for hooking an enemy's shield, maybe even tripping them up.
And then there's the big one.
The Dane axe.
Yeah.
Truly massive. Two-handed, these huge crescent-shaped blades. Sometimes, sources suggest, up to 45 centimeters across.
Wow.
Yeah, a serious weapon. Needed real strength to wield effectively.
And speaking of images we see,
Well,
what about the double-bitted axe? Blade on both sides, common in movies.
Right. Well, the sources are pretty clear on this one. Double-bitted axes are extremely rare in finds. Almost non-existent, actually.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, think about it. More material, probably heavier, maybe less practical in a shield wall. Almost all the axes archaeologists find are single-headed. That double axe thing seems to be a much later artistic invention, not historical reality, according to our sources.
Okay, good debunking right there.
Yeah.
And materials. What were they made of?
Mostly wrought iron,
Yeah.
but they'd weld on a harder steel cutting edge.
Ah, clever.
Yeah, it made them less expensive to produce than, say, a sword. Another reason they were so widespread. Standard work for any decent blacksmith.
And there's this fascinating detail. I think it's in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda. They named their axes.
Yes.
Right?
Isn't that amazing? They weren't just tools or weapons, they had personalities. Often given names, sometimes apparently after she trolls. It just adds this incredible cultural layer.
Beyond the axe, then. What else was fundamental? The knife?
Absolutely fundamental. The knife. Our sources, mainly the graves, show it almost everywhere. Men, women, children. It was basically the only weapon everyone was allowed to carry, even slaves.
So like a multi-tool almost. Small ones for everyday tasks.
Exactly. Your basic utility knife.
Okay.
But then you get longer ones, maybe for hunting, maybe for combat.
And the scene axe, that's distinct, right?
Yeah, the scene axe is a heavier, single-edged weapon. Often has that sort of broken back shape to the blade. Think of it maybe like a machete or a big fighting knife. Some of the larger ones were effectively short swords. Simple, sturdy, relatively easy to make and use.
Okay, so axe, knife, suit axe.
But what about the spear? The sources suggest this might have been the most common weapon.
That's a really strong argument based on the evidence, yeah. Especially for the peasant class or the general levy. But it was a principal weapon for all warriors, really. Why? Because it fits so perfectly with their formations and tactics.
Makes sense for a shield wall. Precisely. You've got these metal heads, maybe 20 to 60 centimeters long, getting longer in later periods. The sources suggest on a long wooden shaft, usually ash, maybe 2 to 3 meters long.
And the design varied.
It did. The sources point to different types. You see lighter, narrower heads, probably designed for throwing, like javelins.
Right.
And then heavier, broader heads, definitely meant for thrusting from behind that shield wall.
The spear also had this huge cultural significance, didn't it? Tied to Odin.
Oh, absolutely. Odin's main weapon in the mythology is his spear, Gungnir. And there's that amazing custom mentioned in the Eyrbyggja saga.
Where they throw a spear over the enemy.
Yeah. To start the battle, basically claiming the enemy dead for Odin, it just shows how deeply their religious beliefs were woven into their way of war.
And like the axes, they weren't always just plain iron.
Not at all. We find pattern welded spearheads, decorated sockets.
Hmm.
It shows real craftsmanship, even on what was probably the most common weapon. They valued artistry there, too.
Now, the sagas mention other things, pole arms like the atgeir or the hugspjot. What do the sources say about finding those?
This is where it gets a bit tricky. The sagas describe them sometimes in detail, like Gunnar Hamandarsson's famous Akir in Jarl's saga.
No. But we don't find many.
Exactly. Archaeologically, weapons that clearly match those specific saga descriptions are very rare from the Viking Age itself.
So what does that mean?
Well, it's debatable. Were they just super rare elite weapons?
Yeah.
Or were the sagas, written down centuries later, maybe influenced by the kinds of weapons common in the High Middle Ages when they were being recorded?
Interesting. A bit of a puzzle the sources leave us with.
Is
Okay, moving to ranged weapons. The sling.
simple, effective, especially for maybe the lower classes. Easy to make rope, leather. Slingers could act as pretty effective light infantry harassing the enemy.
And bows and arrows, of course, for hunting and war.
Essential, often made from woods like yew, ash, or elm. And these weren't kids' toys. War bows could have a draw weight, sources suggest, over 100 pounds.
That's powerful. Seriously powerful. Giving an effective range of at least 200 meters. Later on, a bow shot was actually used as a unit of measurement about 227 meters.
Wow. And the arrowheads.
Typically iron, fixed with a tang, though you do see wood, bone, or antler used sometimes. Barbed arrows get mentioned in written sources, but finding actual archaeological evidence for them is surprisingly limited.
Okay, so axes and spears were common, maybe the backbone. But the sword, that was different according to the sources.
Oh, completely different league. The sword was very costly. Reserved for the elite, the jarls, the nobles, it was a powerful symbol of high status, wealth, and honor.
The basic design wasn't unique to Vikings, though.
No, the single-handed, double-edged blade may be up to 90 centimeters long. It evolved from the Roman spatha, and you saw similar swords across Europe at the time.
But here's where looking closely at the archaeology gets really interesting, right? Some swords found in graves. They seem almost too fancy. Maybe not built for heavy combat. That's exactly it. The sources push us to think critically. While some were undoubtedly fearsome weapons, finding these highly decorated swords in burials suggests that for some, their primary role might have been as a status object, a symbol of power, rather than something you'd expect to bash against shields every day.
It complicates the picture.
It really does.
And the blades themselves tell a story about craft and trade.
A huge story. Early on, you see a lot of pattern welding, twisting different rods of iron and steel together to create these beautiful, watery patterns on the blade.
Right, visible patterns.
Yeah. Later, you get more swords made of homogeneous steel, often higher quality steel imported from places like the Rhineland. Sources mention famous workshops or brands, like swords marked Ingelry or the very famous Vielfbert.
Those Vielspurt swords were supposedly superior.
Generally considered to be, yes, better carbon content, better forging,
Yeah.
highly prized. Then, local Scandinavian craftsmen would often take these imported blades and add their own incredibly ornate hilts and pommels. Grips were organic wood, horn, antler, sometimes wrapped in textile.
The sources really stress how valuable these were.
Immensely. Owning a sword was a major goal. A farmer might save up for years, maybe after a couple of successful raids, just to afford one. That quote from the Laxdala saga. Valuing a sword at half a crown.
Which was equal to
16 milk cows. I mean, that gives you the sense of the investment. They were heirlooms, passed down, gaining prestige over time, importing the blade, decorating it locally. It was a specialized, high-value process.
And we see regional variations too, like those single-edged swords in eastern Norway.
Yeah, sometimes called sabers or just very large sixes. Another detail the archaeology brings out.
The sagas also talk about testing sword quality, that bending test.
Right, the ultimate test, apparently. Could you bend the tip right back to the hilt? And would it spring back straight without staying bent? A blade that took a permanent bend was called dagger, sort of like doughy or weak. It shows how much they valued flexibility, resilience, not just hardness.
So good blades were treasured, which might explain that strange practice of killing swords found in burials.
It's a really striking thing you see in the archaeology. Swords deliberately bent, snapped, damaged before being buried. Why? Maybe a ritual act, decommissioning the weapon along with the warrior, taking it out of the world of the living.
Or maybe just practical.
Could be. Make it useless to grave robbers. It was incredibly valuable metal, after all. The sources, well, the finds themselves, leave us with both possibilities.
Okay, let's switch to defense. The shield. The round shield seems to be the main thing for most fighters.
That's certainly what the sources point to, the most common form of defense. Often made of lighter woods, linden, fir, poplar, alder.
Lighter woods, not oak.
Apparently not usually oak. These lighter woods are less dense, maybe less likely to split badly when hit compared to oak, and they'd often reinforce the edge with leather, or sometimes an iron rim. The center had an iron boss to protect the hand grip.
What about size? Did that change?
It seems to have varied quite a bit. Sources suggest anywhere from 45 centimeters up to 120 centimeters, which is huge. But maybe 75 to 90 centimeters was more typical, especially in the later Viking Age. Possibly smaller shields earlier on, larger ones later.
And they weren't just plain wood, were they?
No, definitely not always. Many were likely painted a single bright color makes sense for identification on a chaotic battlefield. But sources like scalding poetry, these shield poems, describe intricate painted designs. Crosses, sun wheels, geometric patterns, even complex mythological scenes.
And we find evidence of that.
We do. Finds sometimes show traces of paint, and some shield bosses are incredibly ornate, decorated with silver or gold. So that level of artistry definitely existed.
The Goksat ship find those shields hung on the side tells us something else too.
Right. The ship had holes along the gunwale, specifically for hanging shields. They call these shield lists, or shield racks. It wasn't just for show, though it looked impressive. It offered some extra protection to the crew from waves, maybe arrows when approaching land.
Now, that other shield type, the kite shield, long teardrop shape. Did the Vikings introduce that one? That's a common idea.
Yeah, it's often associated with the Normans, who were descended from Vikings. But the current understanding, based on the sources, is that the Vikings didn't introduce it. Evidence suggests it actually originated earlier, maybe in the Byzantine Empire, and spread through the Frankish world.
So the Normans adopted it, but it wasn't a Viking invention.
That seems to be the consensus now. The round shield was the classic Viking shield.
Okay, so they have their round shields. How did they use them together? The famous shield wall.
The Skjoldborg. Absolutely crucial, and historical accounts describe it clearly. This wasn't some disorganized brawl. It was a highly disciplined formation.
How did it work?
Warriors would stand shoulder to shoulder, interlocking their shields to create a solid, unified barrier. It protected them from charges, from arrows and javelins. And it wasn't static. They could move forward, like a slow-moving fortress.
A mobile fortress, yeah.
Spears would thrust out from between or over the shields. Axes and swords could strike over the top or low down. The monk, Abbo Cernus, watching the siege of Paris in 885-886, described the Vikings using something very much like this, a protective testudo formation to advance under fire.
And there was another formation mentioned, the wedge.
Yes, the Svinfylking, the boar formation, or swine array. A wedge shape designed specifically to punch through an enemy line, break their cohesion.
Both sound like they require serious discipline.
Immense discipline and courage. Sources emphasize that the success of these tactics depended entirely on unity, holding the line, trusting the man next to you. It speaks volumes about their collective fighting spirit.
All right, let's talk armor. What protected the body? Here the sources are less clear.
Much less clear, yeah. Our knowledge is based on relatively few finds compared to weapons. It's patchy.
Helmets, for instance. We picture them, but actual finds.
Very few complete ones. We have fragments, pieces. The Germanbu helmet from Norway is the most famous complete one.
What's that like?
It's 10th century. A Spangenhelm type, built from plates riveted together, rounded cap, and crucially, that spectacle guard protecting the eyes and nose. Maybe had a mail curtain and eventail hanging down too. The Yarm helmet, found more recently in England, is quite similar, also 10th century.
But those are exceptions.
They seem to be. If you look at contemporary illustrations, like on runestones, you often see much simpler helmets. Maybe just a conical cap, sometimes with a nose guard, sometimes not even that, based on how few metal helmets we find overall.
They were probably quite rare.
Research strongly suggests they were rare. Expensive? Maybe only for the chieftains or wealthiest warriors.
Which brings us to horned helmets.
Yes. Let's just state it clearly based on the sources. The horned helmets associated with Vikings are a complete fantasy.
Invented when?
19th century Romanticism. Probably got a big boost from Wagner's opera designs. There were horned helmets way back in the Bronze Age, thousands of years earlier, but those were almost certainly ceremonial, not for battle. You just wouldn't wear big, impractical horns in a real fight.
Okay, so helmets are rare. What about body armor? Chainmail, the byrnie.
Also incredibly rare in the archaeological record. Again, the Guramunbu burial had fragments of mail.
Why so rare? Burial customs. or cost?
Probably both, but cost is a huge factor here. Think about making a mail shirt. Thousands and thousands of tiny iron rings, each one needing to be individually riveted shut.
That sounds incredibly time-consuming and expensive.
Exactly. So like helmets, mail was likely restricted to the real elite. Men of high status, professional warriors, maybe like those mentioned in the Great Heathen Army accounts, or at major battles like Fulford.
And how effective was it?
Good against cuts, slashing attacks. Less effective against, say, a powerful spear thrust or a heavy crushing blow, and you'd absolutely need thick padding worn underneath a gambeson or a chiton to absorb the impact.
What about other types of armor? Lamellar, leather.
Lamellar armor, small overlapping plates laced together, is suggested by a find of over 30 small iron plates in Birka, Sweden. But there's debate. Were those plates worn by a Scandinavian Viking, or maybe by a foreign mercenary from the east where lamellar was more common? The sources aren't conclusive.
And quilted cloth or leather?
We assume they must have existed. Quilted cloth padding, a gambeson, makes sense under mail or even on its own. Leather armor is possible. But the problem is these organic materials almost never survive in the ground for 1,000 years. So archaeological evidence is virtually non-existent. Runestones sometimes show warriors in armor that doesn't quite look like mail. Maybe it's lamellar, maybe it's something else entirely. It's hard to see for sure based on the sources we have.
There's that mention in the saga of St. Olaf.
Warrior Hun's enchanted reindeer hide tunic. Yeah, probably more legend than standard kit. And good quality leather was actually quite expensive back then, too.
So pulling it all together from the sources, what was the average Viking wearing for protection?
The most likely picture, based on the rarity of metal armor and the survival issues with organic materials, is that the average Viking warrior probably fought in their regular sturdy woolen clothing. Their primary defense, maybe their only defense apart from their skill, was their shield.
Which makes that shield wall even more critical.
Absolutely essential. It was collective armor because individual armor was so scarce.
It's really striking how much foreign influence crops up in the sources when you look at the weapons and armor.
Especially Frankish influence, yeah.
Yeah.
In the earlier period, they acquired Frankish goods through trade. High-quality swords, spearheads.
But then the Franks tried to stop that.
They did. As Viking raids became a serious problem, the Frankish kings banned the sale of weapons and armor to them. So how did the Vikings get them then?
Plunder.
Plunder. Raiding became a primary source for acquiring the best gear. And possessing these foreign-made arms became a real status symbol, showing you were successful, connected, powerful. It's noted in several sources.
Those Vilf-Bert swords, for example, known for being Frankish and superior.
Generally, yes. The sources suggest they had better steel, better balance. While Scandinavians were certainly making their own excellent weapons, the very best swords and spearheads were often imports, at least initially.
Though you mentioned earlier the actual number of confirmed Frankish swords found isn't overwhelming.
Right, it's important context. Of thousands of Viking swords found in Norway, only about 170 are definitely identified as Frankish imports. So there was clearly a very strong local production, maybe copying or adapting those foreign styles and techniques. And decoration was key, using imported silver and gold for inlay work on locally finished hilts and blades.
We also see mentions of foreign armor being used.
Yes, the Heimskringla saga, for instance, describes warriors at the Battle of Nesjar in 1016 wearing coats of ringmail and in foreign helmets. It suggests imported armor was known and valued by the elite.
By the mid-9th century, it sounds like Frankish arms were almost the standard to aspire to.
It seems that way. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, when he encountered Rose Vikings on the Volga, noted that every warrior carried a sword of the Frankish type.
And the Franks got tougher on the export bans.
They did. There were specific laws. The Capitulaire Bononians in 811 forbade clergy from trading weapons. And later, Charles the Bald, in 864, apparently made selling weapons or armor to non-Franks punishable by death.
Which leads to that interesting theory some historians propose based on these sources.
That the bans, meant to weaken the Vikings, might have actually backfired. By making it harder to buy the best weapons, they might have inadvertently pushed the Vikings even more towards raiding to acquire them. It's a compelling idea looking at the timeline of laws and raiding intensity.
Beyond just where they came from, the sources emphasize quality and decoration. These weren't just crude tools.
Not at all. They were functional, yes, but also status symbols. Quality meant more than just sharpness. It meant durability, good balance, especially for a sword. You wanted the center of mass near your hand for better control.
And that elasticity test we talked about.
The bending test, yeah. A blade that bent and stayed bent to gray was flawed. The ability to spring back showed superior metallurgy and craftsmanship. Resilience was prized just as highly as hardness.
Decoration, too, wasn't just for looks.
It added value, status, symbolic meaning, power, wealth. Shields had those painted designs, sometimes really ornate bosses. Weapons had elegant inlay with copper, silver, intricate geometric or animal patterns. These decorated pieces were also used as high-status gifts, cementing alliances, as recorded in some historical accounts.
And pattern welding wasn't just functional, it was decorative, too.
Absolutely. Twisting those rods of iron and steel together before forging them flat created those beautiful, almost hypnotic patterns right on the surface of the blade. You see it on swords, spears, knives. It was a real hallmark of Viking Age smithing, and it made the weapons visually stunning and highly prized. The actual cutting edge itself was usually plain, homogeneous steel for maximum effectiveness, but the body of the blade was often a canvas for this artistry.
Okay, now for a topic that really captures the imagination. The Berserkers. This is where it gets, well, wild.
Definitely gets wild. These figures stride through the sagas as this elite, almost supernatural kind of warrior.
Known for what? Their battle fury.
Their uncontrollable battle fury,
Yeah.
Often described as mercenaries, roaming in bands. The sources link them strongly with the worship of Odin, the god of war and ecstasy, and even with myths of shape-shifting.
The sagas describe the state they entered Berserker gang. What was that like?
The descriptions are intense. Howling like beasts, biting the edges of their shields, seeming completely immune to pain or fear, unstoppable.
And there was a lead up to it.
Apparently. Sources mention shivering, chattering teeth, their faces turning red and swelling up, then just exploding into this uncontrollable rage. Afterwards, they'd be totally wiped out, physically and mentally exhausted for days.
What caused it? That's the big question modern researchers ask when looking at these accounts. Just psychological frenzy.
That's one theory, extreme conditioning. But others look at the specific symptoms described in the sources and wonder about substances.
Hallucinogens.
That's a prominent theory. Research, for instance, by Karsten Fodder, has pointed towards hyoscyamus niger-henbane as a strong possibility.
Henbane.
Yeah, it's a plant known to cause powerful hallucinations, delusions, a sense of detachment, dulled pain, erratic behavior. A lot of the symptoms seem to fit the saga descriptions quite well. Better, perhaps, than the older theory about the Amanita muscaria mushroom, though that's still discussed.
So the idea is they might have deliberately ingested something to induce that state.
It's a plausible interpretation of the historical descriptions, yeah.
Yeah.
Trying to achieve that state of Odinic fury.
And the name itself, Berserker, what does that mean?
Most likely interpretation is Old Norse berserker, meaning bear shirt, suggesting they literally wore animal pelts like bear skins or maybe wolf skins for the related Ulfhednar.
To channel the animal's ferocity.
Perhaps. That's the idea. Though there's an older theory suggesting berserker, bear shirt, meaning they fought without armor, maybe even nude, as a sign of their fearlessness and devotion to Odin. Also a pretty effective psychological weapon, you'd imagine.
What do the artistic depictions show?
It varies. Some images seem to show figures in animal hides. Others look unarmored. Some, like on the Torslanda plates from Sweden, might even show figures in armor but with animalistic features. And yes, some older depictions connect them with horned helmets, but again, probably symbolic or ceremonial, not battle gear.
But their role in battle, according to the sources, was clear.
Oh yeah, they were shock troops. Unleashed at the start of a battle or at a critical moment to smash into the enemy line, cause terror and disruption purely through their ferocity.
And their belief system probably played a role, believing in Valhalla.
Absolutely. The idea that dying bravely in battle meant you'd feast in Odin's hall and fight again at Ragnarok, that certainly wouldn't hurt your willingness to charge into danger, as the sagas often emphasize.
But this wasn't a permanent feature of Viking warfare.
No, it seems to have faded. Historical sources suggest Jarl Eiríkur Håkonarson, a powerful ruler in Norway, actually outlawed berserkers around the early 11th century. By the 12th century, they seem to have largely disappeared from the historical record.
Okay, one last crucial piece of the puzzle. The ships. We can't talk Viking warfare without the longship.
Absolutely impossible.
Yeah.
The sources make it clear their ships were utterly integral to their military success.
More than just transport, right? They were a strategic advantage.
Huge advantage. They gave them unparalleled mobility, swift raids along coastlines, yes, but also the ability to penetrate deep inland via rivers, bypassing land defenses. This is described again and again in chronicles from England, France, everywhere they went.
And they fought on the ships too, naval battles.
They did. Tactics mentioned in sources include ramming, grappling ships together, and boarding actions. Often, they'd lash their ships side by side to create these large, stable, floating platforms.
Basically, a shield wall on water.
Exactly. A floating battlefield where they could use their infantry tactics.
And the ships also offered a way out.
Critically important. Strategic retreat. They could strike hard and fast, gather loot, or achieve an objective, and then disappear back downriver or out to sea before a larger, slower enemy force could corner them. This naval edge, shown so clearly in the sources, was fundamental to their expansion and impact across Europe.
So pulling all these threads together from this deep dive into the sources, what's the big picture of the Viking warrior?
Well, it's vastly more complex and sophisticated than that simple image of the axe-wielding brute. The sources reveal highly adaptable fighters.
Using a wide range of gear.
Exactly. A diverse arsenal, from the common spear and versatile axe to the high-status sword, plus effective ranged weapons like bows and slings. They weren't locked into one way of fighting.
And tactically smart, too.
Very much so. Mastering disciplined formations like the shield wall, using shock tactics like the wedge formation. These are described in contemporary accounts, not just sagas, employing terrifying specialists like the Berserkers, whatever the true nature.
And combining land and sea power.
Fundamentally, their success relied on integrating land tactics with that incredible naval mobility, understanding terrain, using psychological warfare. It was a really potent combination.
So the sources show us an approach to warfare that was sophisticated, effective, blending the practical with the cultural, even the spiritual.
Absolutely. Craftsmanship, status, tactics, belief. It's all interwoven in the picture the sources give us.
It really is fascinating when you piece it together from the archaeology, the sagas, the historical records. The reality of Viking combat was so much richer and more varied than the popular stereotype.
It really was. And thinking about something like the Berserkers again, that idea of entering a trance, the shield biting, maybe using substances, it does make you wonder, doesn't it?
Light or what?
Just how much effective warfare throughout history has relied not only on weapons and training, but on pushing the absolute limits of what humans can endure, pushing boundaries of courage, psychology, maybe even perception itself.
That's a really provocative thought to end on. Something for you, the listener, to maybe ponder as you read other accounts of historical conflict. How much is the tool, and how much is the mind wielding?